Hello there, Epidemics. Sorry I was a little bit late opening up the Zoom room. Didn't give you guys a chance to find that lizard. Oh, I see some people have already seen it. Good. All right. So we're going to jump right into it. The assignments, of course, there's a quiz and a journal entry due before midnight on Sunday. And the project pre-approval is due Sunday, March 6th before midnight.
Do you want us to email that to you?
There is a spot for you to submit it on Blackboard.
Okay.
In the project folder.
And it's just our topic and like how we're going to do the project?
Yes, that's exactly it.
I thought an essay was due Sunday. Am I mistaken?
Did I?
No, yeah, she forgot to, it's not the journal entry, it's the essay that's due.
Okay, cheers.
Yes, sorry. I did the same thing I did last time. I just copied over the announcements. Forgot to change them.
There's no quiz either.
There's no quiz. It's just the essay. Yeah. Whew. I'm running late and I'm disorganized. That's a bad sign.
Professor, what's in the corona vaccine? I took another shot and it's whooping my butt right now.
It is a butt kicking vaccine. Absolutely.
Oh my God.
What you're feeling is actually your immune system recognizing the protein and starting to mount a defense against it. So it's an mRNA vaccine. And when we get closer to the end of the smallpox discussion, we'll talk about vaccines in a lot of detail.
Okay.
But it's your immune system that you're feeling. If your immune system didn't respond, you wouldn't be feeling bad. So there's good and bad there, right?
Yeah.
All right. So we are talking smallpox, which is nasty, 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 and we're all very happy it doesn't exist anymore. And I talked about, we were starting to talk about pox viruses, how smallpox is not related to chickenpox, but it is related to pox viruses like avian pox and cowpox. So this is cowpox.
Wait, cowpox? Is that this? That's not the same as smallpox, right?
It is not the same as smallpox, but it's closely related.
Yeah, I've never heard of it. That's why I was...
You probably haven't raised cows. Cowpox is a mild disease in cows. It causes pustules on the udder. If humans get infected with cowpox, usually the infection is mild. This is a pretty severe cowpox infection. You'll get a couple of pustules, some minor symptoms. But why do we care? If you get cowpox, you are then immune to smallpox. And this is what allowed the early smallpox vaccine. It was cowpox. So smallpox itself, remember we call those variola major and variola minor, only infects people. There's no reservoir. Have I defined reservoir for you guys yet? Do you guys remember what that is? Nope. Okay. A reservoir is a species that can be infected with little or no symptoms, and can then spread that disease to people or other species. So a reservoir, the animal that's infected doesn't really get sick, but if people interact with that animal, then we get sick. Bats don't get a lot of symptoms from the coronavirus family, but they can spread it to people. There is also no vector. A vector is, it usually refers to an insect that can spread disease between infected hosts. And it can be between different people. It can be between animals and people. We tend to think about, when we talk about plague, we'll talk about how the flea spread the plague from rats into humans. Malaria is spread from human to human by mosquitoes. Lyme disease is through the bite of a tick. These are all vectors. Well, there's no vector and no reservoir species. Smallpox infects people, and that is it. Julia, go ahead.
Is Lyme disease contagious?
Not to the best of my knowledge, you have to get bitten by an infected tick.
Okay, I was just wondering.
Yeah. And the fact that it's only infecting humans, and the fact that if you get cowpox, you become immune to smallpox, those two things allowed us to eradicate smallpox in the early 1970s. And we're going to talk about the story of how we did that. But first, we're going to talk a little bit more about the disease. Okay, if you like screenshotting, now's your time. All right, so where did smallpox begin? Where did it come from? What is the origin? We don't really know. There are some people who think it first arose in Africa, mostly because it's clearly been in people for thousands of years. Somewhere between 5,000 and 20,000 years old. So it's been in us for this time period. We find Egyptian mummies that have pustules that are, they're mummified. You can still see the smallpox pustules on them that are at least 5,000 years old, but no signs of smallpox in Europe or Asia from this time period. So it probably was existing in Egypt probably because it arose in Africa and it hadn't quite spread out of Egypt at the 5,000 years ago time period. It really started to show up in Europe during the Crusades. You guys know what the Crusades were?
Was that when? Oh,
Go
yeah, you
ahead.
can go. Sorry. No, you're
Is the-
good. I interrupted.
Is it the Christian Crusades when they was around murdering because you didn't believe in Jesus?
Yes.
Yeah.
Religious people were gathering armies and marching into places like the Middle East to kill the non-Christians. Exactly. And they took the smallpox back to Europe with them.
So if they mind their business, they would have been better, basically.
If they had minded their business, we would all be in a better place.
Sure.
It did not occur in the so-called New World until the Europeans brought it. The New World being the Americas. So North, Central, and South America is what we call the New World. We call Eurasia and Africa the Old World. It's a very Eurocentric view, but it's nice to have those big grand terms for these areas. So since the Native Americans, when they came over to the New World, they did not have smallpox. They did not bring it. So we know that it was not, smallpox was not circulating in Asia and Russia, what's now Russia, at that time period, about 20,000 years ago. What a lot of the leading idea about the origin is that it was a rodent pox. So it was infecting mice and rats, and it jumped into humans around the same time we developed agriculture, which was 10 to 12,000 years ago.
And that's what they thought it was.
Okay, was that Julia?
Yeah.
Could you repeat that?
And that's what they thought it was.
That's what we think is the origin of smallpox in humans. We think it came from a disease that infected rodents that managed to start infecting people.
So field mice, basically?
Yeah, field mice. Yep. And here we go again. Diseases tend to come into humans a lot from rodents and bats. We've talked about this. Do you guys remember why rodents and bats are major sources of new diseases? Julia, your hands up?
Because there's so many of them.
Yeah, exactly. Rodents make up nearly half of all animal species, and bats make up another 25%. So there's so many species of rodents and bats, and there tend to be lots and lots and lots of them. In addition to that, they tend to do pretty well living in close proximity to humans. Okay, screenshot time. So smallpox is highly contagious. About half of people who are exposed will get sick, which is, it's a really, really high rate of infection from exposure. There is a long time period where people are contagious. Starting shortly before symptoms, so you can be contagious before you know you're sick, lasting till the last scab falls off. So those pustules scab over, and those scabs contain contagious virus. The scab itself contains live, remember, we don't call viruses alive, but it contains live virus for 2 to 4 months. So if you get exposed to a scab that fell off of somebody 3 months ago, you can still get smallpox from it.
Does it go all over your body, like your feet, your genitalia, everywhere?
Outside and inside. Yeah.
Scary stuff I ever heard of.
Yes. Yes. This is a scary disease. Okay. So how is it spread? It can spread a whole bunch of different ways. So there's respiratory spread. This form is less likely to spread. You have to be in close proximity to somebody who's infected, who is exhaling, sneezing, or coughing virus particles. And these exhaled particles do not last long in the environment. There can be what we call vertical transmission, which is from a mother to her child while she is pregnant. Those scabs, that is a really big way that they spread. Those scabs are going to stick to things like blankets, eating utensils, clothing. So if we think about how these spread, we can see a couple of things that lead to the spread of this disease. Crowds, obviously. Anytime there's a contagious disease around, the more time you spend in a crowd, the more likely you're going to get it. But also sharing linens. This is an old disease. And as we will see, until relatively modern times, the people did not wash sheets and blankets very often. It was not unusual for multiple people to use the same set of blankets or pass them along to other family members who need them. Clothing was shared until it was literally falling off because fabric was expensive and hard to get to. We saw, of course, migrations and warfare, carrying it, warfare being with the Crusades, and colonization. This is how it came to the New World. All right. So if you guys need your screenshot, here we go. So during the 17th century, this was a common childhood disease. If you survived it in childhood, you would be immune. I mean, there are always exceptions, but generally speaking, if you got it during childhood, you would not get it as an adult. During the 17th century, about a third of childhood deaths were due to smallpox. And remember, childhood mortality was very significantly higher than it is today. You certainly did not expect all of your children to make it to adulthood. And if smallpox came through, you would lose, you could lose a third of your children, easy. So this has been called the worst of human maladies. And it's been called a grotesque torture. Smallpox lasts about a month. It's a long, long disease process. You have symptoms like fever, nausea, severe backache, which is kind of odd sounding, but severe headache and convulsions. And those scabs, I mentioned this a minute ago, all over the skin and inside the body. And those scabs would result in lifelong scars. So I'm going to walk through the course of the disease. So we start with an incubation period. An incubation period is the time from initial infection, so from the point where you got infected to the onset of symptoms. So you don't start getting symptoms the day you get infected by something. It takes a while. And that incubation period varies for different diseases. In the case of smallpox, it was about 12 days, so almost 2 weeks. So try and track back where you got it from. Do you remember who you talked to 2 weeks ago? Nope. Then the fever and body aches. People were often bedridden, literally were so sick, they wouldn't go to work. They wouldn't even cook for themselves. So if somebody wasn't taking care of them, they could start having malnutrition and starvation. And that would last 2 to 4 days. That's kind of that's the beginning of the bad part. Then the rash shows up, those pustules. Usually starts on the face and inside the mouth. I mean, I look at those pustules and it makes me cringe, but then somebody says, it starts inside the mouth. And oh man, does that. It's gross. And those pustules are filled with virions. Virions, remember, are individual virus particles. And those pustules in the mouth can release virions when the patient coughs or even breathes. So they're constantly exhaling virus. Yes.
Sorry. Well, I was in history. We were watching something on like we learned about the Revolutionary War and like the fight Americans against the British. And during that time, there was smallpox outbreak, and we were watching like a movie about it. And I guess like it was like an early form of the vaccine. They would actually like, this can be kind of graphic, but like they would take pus from someone who had like died or someone who had it. And then they'd cut the skin of someone and then they'd put it in there as like the vaccine, kind of.
Yes, you are jumping several pages ahead on my notes.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. But you're right.
I just remembered, like I learned that.
Yeah, that was one way that people tried to early vaccinate.
Yeah.
And they would try and choose the donors for the pus, people who had a milder disease, in the hopes that it was a less dangerous disease and not that it was the person's immune system did a better job or didn't cause as many symptoms.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going to get to that. Absolutely.
Oh, good.
Okay. The lesions would enlarge and become hard. And in some places, they would become confluent. Confluent means basically they were growing together and over each other. So not a bunch of distinct individual pustules, but like all covering the entire surface, often of your face. At this point, they would start to burst and scab over. And apparently they smelled bad. So you could smell it. And if you're smelling it, that's bad because you're probably inhaling virus. Then the scabs were itchy and they would peel and fall off. And a lot of people would scratch them off because they were itchy. And then those scabs, of course, as I mentioned, are contagious or infectious. They can cause disease in new people. The scars were called pox marks. And the skin was raw where the scabs fell off. So it kind of took off the upper layer of the skin when those scabs came off, which led to secondary skin infections. Mortality, 30%. So half of people exposed would get the disease, and of those, 30% would die. So smallpox could kill off a huge percentage of a population if it came through your community. All right, so this is the typical course of the disease. There were some more severe forms. So screenshot so I can do more typing. In 5 to 10% of infected people, these got a severe form. This form had a longer period of fever. The lesions were slower growing. And it looked a little different. They weren't the same appearance. They weren't that distinctive circular raised structure. In this form, almost always fatal. And it was more likely to be seen in children. There's also a hemorrhagic form. Hemorrhagic means bleeding. And it was damage to the blood vessels. And it was rare, even more rare than the severe form. Less than 2% of cases. But these people basically would bleed out, which means they would lose too much blood and they wouldn't be able to survive. So again, almost always fatal. So those are the severe forms. Regardless, even if you had the minor form, recovery was long and slow, and there could often be permanent damage. If you were lucky, you just had scars. You could also have blindness. Scabs can form on your eyes just like they can form on your skin. It would cause neurological damage. Those pustules in the inside of the body could damage internal organs, including the intestines, lungs, and the heart. So you could have all kinds of long-term damage, permanent damage. All right, so I told you that around 30% of people who were infected would die. This is the CFR, or the case fatality rate. How many people who are infected will die from a disease? Smallpox is one of the big ones. The CFR is around 30%. Okay. Go ahead and take a picture of that. All right, so the information we have on total number of deaths is unreliable. Up until relatively recent times, a lot of people would not have birth certificates or death certificates. The government did not keep track of people that well. And there are still countries where that's the case. The estimate is that smallpox was responsible for 10% of all deaths in Europe. Europe's the place where we have the best information from. And that would equal 500,000 deaths per year. It was the leading cause of blindness. The last 100 years of smallpox estimated killed 500 million dead. The last 100 years of it. In the 20th century, from 1900 to 1973 or so, over 300 million deaths. So that was in a just over 70-year time period. The current population of the United States is just a little bit over 300 million today. 320, 330 million, somewhere in there. So that's like losing the population of the United States in a 70-year time period. We can see that it was partially responsible for a population collapse in Mexico. So this graph is the estimated population of Mexico from 1520 through the 1800s, the early 1800s. Before the Europeans established in the Mexico area, it was estimated that there was a population of 21 to 22 million people living there. In 1520, smallpox arrives in Mexico and kills about 8 million people. And then there were two pandemics of this disease called, oh gosh, I have no idea how to pronounce Aztec words. Cocolitzli, which we think was a form of salmonella, but we don't know a lot about it. And that disease was a major problem both before the Europeans came in as well as after. But the smallpox, kind of started a series of collapses that brought the population from, over 21 million down to less than 2 million in less than 100 years. Okay, time for me to move on to the next slide. This child on the left was one of the last, possibly the last person to naturally be infected with smallpox. And that was in 1973. This person on the right, you can see the scars on his nose. Those are smallpox scars. You can see them a little bit on the forehead as well, and it's on the cheeks. All right, I have a quick quote I want to read. Thomas Macaulay wrote, "The havoc of the plague has been far more rapid," talking about plague, the disease, "but the plague has visited our shores only once or twice within living memory, and the smallpox was always present, filling the churchyard with corpses, tormenting with constant fears all whom it had not yet stricken, leaving on those whose lives it spared the hideous traces of its power, turning the babe into a changeling at which the mother shuddered, and making the eyes and cheeks of the betrothed maiden objects of horror to her lover." So smallpox kind of came to Europe and became a more prominent illness after the Black Death, which we haven't talked about yet. I'm going to go to a white screen, spare you guys having to look at the poor child with smallpox. So smallpox became more common in the 17th and 18th centuries. This is probably due to population growth and increased population density. People living in more crowded conditions, interacting with more people. Because smallpox only infects humans, it needs a large concentration of people to continue. If we didn't have enough people in an area, smallpox would, kind of die out. It would quit being in that community. So the disease would get passed around either within one community or a cluster of neighboring communities. All the adults would be resistant because they had it in childhood. There would be what is called herd immunity. Herd immunity means there are not enough vulnerable people for a disease to continue spreading. We're going to get into a lot more detail about this when we're talking about immune systems and vaccines. But new children would be born vulnerable or susceptible. And when there were enough new children, here comes smallpox again. And it would infect the children in the community. There would be a wave of exposures. The children who survived would then be immune to smallpox, and you wouldn't see smallpox again until, once again, there were enough new vulnerable people in the population. But despite the fact that it had such a high mortality, people kind of accepted it. Plague during this time would cause hysteria and panic. Plague comes in and everybody freaks out. But smallpox was familiar. So people did not react the same way. Even though the mortality rates of both of these diseases are incredibly high, I mean, if a disease came into my community that would kill off, a third of the children, I'd be freaking out. But it was just part of life back then. This was kind of the way things worked. So smallpox was endemic. Endemic means consistently around. Something that everybody has to deal with, everybody has to learn to live with, or learn to accept the mortality rate of. So when people these days are talking about COVID becoming endemic, COVID's becoming endemic. I don't know about you, but it's not comforting when endemic means we're going to be having thousands of people dying every day. That's not an acceptable thing for me. So when we think about smallpox, the victims are largely infants and children So when plague would came through, plague would cause a lot of children to be orphaned, a lot of women to be widowed. That didn't happen with smallpox. It was kind of a rite of passage. And about half the people on the street had those scars. So you were constantly being reminded of the disease. The disease exists. All of these people have survived it. And people would sometimes deliberately expose their children to others if that person had a mild form of the disease, in the hope that their kid would get the mild form and survive it and then be immune to the more severe form. Okay. Where am I? All right. So if you guys want to take a screenshot of the whiteboard. There's a lot of what I have going on right now. I've got a lot of things to talk about, and I don't have a lot of pictures right here. We're getting through the material much faster today. Jerry's not feeling well and Nate's not here, and you guys are my good talkers. Okay. All right. Where are my things? All right, so European society. Pox-marked women were not valued on the marriage market. So during the peak time period of smallpox, women basically had no rights and really did not have a way of supporting themselves. They went from being their father's daughter to being their husband's wife. And that was kind of the roles that they had. They didn't have a lot of options there. So when women would reach kind of between 14 and 16 years old, they would get, if they were high society, they would be introduced to society. If they were younger, they would, you know, their parents would start looking to marry them off. But if they were pockmarked, a lot of guys didn't want to marry them. And sometimes if women got smallpox later in life, the husbands would leave them. And this left the women impoverished, often forcing them to become beggars or prostitutes, because that's how women could, you know, feed themselves, basically. We know that smallpox was directly responsible for a dynastic change in England. So you may not know a lot about English history, but it's for most of the history of Europe, it was a monarchy, and it would get passed from parent, usually to son, over and over and over again. But the last Smallpox went through the house of Stuart, and the last heir, the last person in line for the throne, died of smallpox in the early 1700s. This caused a huge crisis. Nobody knew who was going to be the next king. There was a lot of stuff going on, a lot of fighting, a lot of political crap, but eventually rule was transferred to a different house, the House of Hanover. So a different group of rich people took over being in charge of the country. All right. So that's Europe. What was going on? What happened in the Americas? Before 1500, there was no smallpox. So when smallpox arrived, it was what is called a virgin soil epidemic. Virgin soil means nobody has immunity. And it's estimated that the Native American population fell by 90% within the century. So between 1500 and 1600, the Native American population fell by 90%. This made it easier for Europeans. Conquerors. So the Europeans could come in, the population was lower, there weren't a lot, there wasn't as much resistance as there would have been if that population hadn't fallen. Because the Europeans, a lot of them had been exposed as during childhood and had some immunity. The best studied incident of this was the Aztecs. In 1500, the Aztec society had between 16 and 25 million people. In 1521, the Spanish invader Cortez took 1,000 men to try and take down the Aztec empire. He got his ass kicked and fled. But the Aztecs didn't come after him. And he thought that was strange. So he went back and found the city nearly empty. His army took smallpox, and smallpox basically caused the end of the Aztec Empire. Sure, other diseases like measles played a role as well, but smallpox was the big one here. And we see similar stories with the Inca and the Maya. Smallpox and measles working together to just destroy these empires, killing huge percentage of the population. The survivors would have PTSD. I mean, imagine if the city of Boston was wiped out. You'd be kind of freaked out and you'd be stressed and have PTSD. The same story repeats when the British invaded Australia. and when the British invaded New Zealand. And we start seeing the use of smallpox in biowarfare. So the British would give Native Americans blankets. Oh, hey, that's nice. We're giving you our nice blankets, right? They would give them blankets from smallpox patients, deliberately exposing their populations to smallpox. They knew what they were doing. There was a letter written by British troops. Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them. And a return letter from a higher ranking British officer said, quote, I will try to inoculate the Indians with some blankets that may fall into their hands, and take care not to get the disease myself. All right, screenshot. Okay. So we all remember in 1492, Columbus discovered the New World, specifically the island of Hispaniola. The natives were healthy, they were friendly. And Columbus apparently got it into his mind that there was gold somewhere on the island. So Columbus is like, I'm going to enslave these people so that they can mine for gold. But Columbus brought smallpox. And smallpox invaded the population, and the population went from an estimated 1 million to 15,000. Julia, go ahead.
Why do we like celebrate him every year, even though there's like evidence that he did all this terrible stuff?
Thank you for asking that question. I wish I had a good answer for you, but it's mostly just yeah, he was a horrible person. He was not the first European to make it to North America, so I really have no idea why we still hail him as a hero.
Yeah,
certainly.
Because I remember in Boston there was a statue of him, and they vandalized it, so they took it down.
Yeah, he doesn't deserve to be celebrated. No.
I will say though that that voyage created what we know as Dominican brothers and sisters.
Yep.
And sugarcane was gold, I guess then.
Yes, yeah, sugarcane was very profitable.
They should have just jumped them. How many people he came with? Like 500?
They didn't know he was going to be evil.
Right. They didn't have guns either. So
yeah, they didn't have guns. That's a big part of it too. Yeah. All right. So Columbus couldn't enslave the locals because there weren't enough of them. So he started importing Africans. The people of Africa had already been exposed to smallpox, so they had some immunity. So that's kind of one of the factors that led to the transatlantic slave trade. Okay. So I'm going to go back to, oh, I'm already on the PowerPoint. I'm going to go on to the next slide. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about herd immunity and the role of vaccination in herd immunity. So if we have a population of people, the people in blue here, who are susceptible to a disease, and you have a couple of people who come into that community and have a contagious disease, that contagious disease spreads easily from one person to the next person until you end up with a high level of people who've been exposed, who've been infected. When you reach this point with smallpox, there aren't enough people to maintain the disease. So that is one way to achieve herd immunity with diseases like smallpox that cause lifelong immunity. If it's a disease like COVID, which produces immunity that lasts for, we don't know exactly how long, but months or years, people eventually become susceptible again. And so that allows for a constantly circulating disease in that community. When we have vaccination or immunization, people who are immunized are not susceptible to the disease. So when you have a large percentage of the population who is vaccinated, that disease can't spread as far because there just aren't as many people being exposed to the disease. I mean, you can see this contagious person interacts with this vulnerable person, but everybody else they interact with is protected. So this is the other way we get herd immunity. And this way, all of these yellow people don't have to get the disease. They just get vaccinated. So when we talk about herd immunity, there is a threshold. A certain percentage of the population has to be immune to prevent the disease from spreading in that community. And so this table lists a whole bunch of contagious diseases and their threshold. So here's smallpox. We need 80 to 85% of a population to be immune in order for smallpox not to spread in that community. There are other diseases, pertussis, which you may also know as whooping cough. You need 92 to 94% of the community to be protected. Measles, you also need up to 90% of the population. Different communities have different thresholds for various reasons, like how much mixing there is, how many people are of the age group that tends to get that disease, how long immunity lasts, and that sort of stuff. R naught is if everybody in a community is vulnerable to that disease, this is how many people will catch that disease from one person who's infected. So for smallpox, if you come into a population where nobody has protection, nobody has any immunity, you will infect between 5 and 7 people. If you have measles and you come into a community that does not have any protection, you will infect between 12 and 18 people. So this is kind of a way to talk about how the spread of that disease is likely to happen. We can compare different diseases and say, okay, we have to worry more about measles than we do about mumps. We also have to worry about how severe the diseases are, but when we're looking at these diseases, these are all pretty severe diseases. So this kind of gives you an idea of which ones are more likely to spread quickly. Okay. So I know it's a little bit early, but we've gone through a lot of material and we're about to have a major shift in our discussion and talk about the original way people tried to provide immunity against smallpox. This woman played a major role in bringing the concept of inoculation to Europe. But I want to hold off and talk about that next time we meet. Does anybody have any questions about what we went over today? Looks like that's a no. Okay. Jerry, rest up, drink lots of fluids. I hope you feel better.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Professor.
Bye.